If you're a fan of the Cosmere, you're probably also a fan of fantasy. And there's no more foundational fantasy series than The Lord of the Rings or the entire Tolkien universe. So in this video, I want to talk about some of the parallels in the setup of those two universes, the setup of a deity and a pantheon of sub-deities, and talk about two of the key distinctions that I think are really important between those two universes. And those two key distinctions are that one, I think the Cosmere is less predictable or less preordained than anything in the Tolkien universe. And then two, that the Cosmere generally has less of this clear-cut distinction between good and evil that plays out in the Tolkien verse. And if you like this kind of content, please subscribe to my channel. I post on all things Cosmere and fantasy as regularly as I can. And this video, if it isn't clear already, will draw from both Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion in the Tolkien universe, and then the Stormlight Archive up through the end of Wind and Truth in the Cosmere universe, along with kind of a couple of snippets in the backdrop of what's happening in other books in the Cosmere. So with that, let's get into it. So to start, the setup of the shards in the Cosmere and the Valar in the Tolkien world are parallel. There's a big deity or one god, Eru Iluvatar or Adonalsium respectively, and then there's a pantheon of sub-deities that are formed from that one god. In the Silmarillion, it's described how the Ainur or the Valar are this pantheon of sub-deities that are formed from Iluvatar's thought. So they're essentially molded from Iluvatar. In the Cosmere, though, the shards are formed directly from Adonalsium, i.e. they are formed after Adonalsium is shattered, and they literally embody Adonalsium. They take up a piece of Adonalsium's power. And so just by virtue of their creation, the shards of the Cosmere are generally, I think, more powerful in relative terms than the Valar in the Tolkien universe. And that's because they wield the one god's power, whereas the Valar, or Iluvatar, while responsible for the creation of the Valar, is separate from the gods, the sub-gods that he created. And that brings us to the first key distinction that I want to highlight here, is that the Cosmere is fundamentally feels more unpredictable than anything in the Tolkien universe, because there isn't something, at least at face value, external that is guiding all of the events in this universe. So for example, in Lord of the Rings, Gandalf famously sacrifices himself in Moria to save the rest of the Fellowship. And when he does, eventually he's brought back to life as Gandalf the White, in order to continue, because his mission was unfinished, in order to continue his mission. And that shows this very clear hand of an external guiding force. In comparison, I think an interesting comparison in the Cosmere is Dalinar at the end of Wind and Truth, who makes a sacrifice, but it's not explicitly clear by the end of the book whether that sacrifice served a greater purpose. In fact, the Blackthorn is claimed by the person that he was trying to oppose, Taravangian. But I want to point out one fascinating thing there, because there's a chance that this aspect of the Cosmere may be shifting. At the end of Wind and Truth, when Dalinar's soul is slipping away and Taravangian tries to grab it, the power says, "You cannot have him, because he's claimed by another." And I've talked about this in other videos, but there's a theory that I personally subscribe to, that Adonalsium did have a grand plan for the Cosmere, and his shattering was a piece of that grand plan, even if he's not physically there to guide it. And so when Dalinar's soul is claimed by another, I think it points to this idea that there is this kind of stream of destiny that is taking the Cosmere along, even though, unlike the Lord of the Rings universe, it is not made explicit yet. And in many ways, that leads to the second key distinction between these universes, that in the Cosmere, the line between good and evil has become blurred over time. And in fact, our perspective as readers shifts the more that we learn about opposing sides. For example, in the Stormlight Archive, begins essentially with Honor and Odium set up as Honor as the good guy and Odium as the bad guy, at least in the deity world. But as the books progress, I think, especially in Wind and Truth, we see the problematic aspects of Honor and his influence on Roshar, and we see, I think, concurrently some of the redeeming aspects of Odium, especially in his defense of Passion and frankly in his defense of some of the more oppressed parts of Roshar. And I think the most obvious depiction of the fact that the lines between Honor and Odium being good or bad respectively are blurred is that they have literally been combined into the same character, into Retribution by the end of Wind and Truth. So what do we take from this? And I've already shared the first part of this, which is I think that as things progress, the Cosmere will progress in a direction that is less chaotic and more preordained in the same way that the Tolkien universe is, as we kind of work towards some potentially intended outcome. But the second part of that is that while the Lord of the Rings or Middle-earth or the Valar in Valinor are good and staying good, and Melkor or Sauron are bad and staying bad, in the Cosmere, I think the shards that we think of as traditionally evil or hatred could morph into something with good that you want to root for, and the shards that we think of as like good could actually morph into something really problematic. And one example I think of that is Harmony in the Mistborn universe, and we see hints of him turning into Discord, which could be a very different type of influence that we have previously seen. And one of the reasons that people, including myself, have loved Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion is that as human beings, I think we want this clarity of good versus evil. But I think one of the things that makes the Cosmere really unique to me is that distinction is trickier and much more complex. And in that sense, I think it's more, frankly, realistic and true to life. And so that's what I have. I'd love to know what you think in the comments below. And I have a second part of this video to compare the shards and the Valar more directly as well, coming shortly. But thank you, everyone. Please like this video and please subscribe if you like this kind of content.